floor to Peter Chase to present the results of the study.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for the opportunity for the German Marshall Fund to my colleagues in Washington, Peter Sparding, as well as Stephanie Sun and Yuki Mukai, to do the study for you. And thank you as well for the opportunity to present it. I know that the time is very short, that you have a very tight schedule to do and many things on your agenda. And I also know that you had a very good exchange this morning with Mr. Director General de Marti. So I will try to keep my remarks very brief. I have done a deck of slides that goes through the study, which I thought might have been provided to the members of the committee before this meeting. I'm not sure that was the case. Please make sure that they are shared with the members afterwards. But basically, what the study does is it tries to describe where the administration is coming from, most importantly, what it's done. And then I was asked to look at specifically what the consequences of that would be on transatlantic trade and on the WTO and the global trading system, looking at scenarios. So what I'd like to do very briefly here is not focus on what it's done. The members of the committee, I think, are fairly well versed in that. But instead to talk about the ethos, where the administration is coming from, because I think it's important that the committee understand that. And then also to talk very briefly about what the scenarios are and where the next steps should be. I think in terms of where the administration is coming from, there's a deep sense in Washington that the United States has been a victim when it comes to trade policy. And it's not just a victim of others, it's very much a sense of victim of previous administrations. One of the most important sentences, I think telling sentences in the first administration trade strategy was that this administration will not, for putative geopolitical advantage, undertake to open its market further to others. And what it's pointing to is that we did a lot of things from this administration's point of view. Previous administrations had opened the U.S. market for the rest of the world for broader advantage. This administration is not going to do that anymore. It leads to a very strong negotiating tactic, which is, we have already given, what are you going to give us? And I think that that underlines all the negotiations that they've been in since. There was a sense that this is demonstrated by the trade deficits that the United States has. There is a slide in that I've given you that shows that while China has by far the largest trade deficit, both on goods and services, right behind it is the European Union at about 150 billion. So the sights of the administration are on Europe. Again, the study is very factual. It goes through a lot of the things that have done. Rather than talk about that, I just want to talk about where we are now on the US-EU, on the WTO, and on China. On EU-US, Mr. de Marti gave you a very detailed discussion this morning, but it's clear that that the steel tariffs are the one thing that's been done. But as the Director General said, it's hurting the United States more than it's hurting Europe. The Commission is going to be firm and stay within the boundaries of the July 25 joint statement. And you could say that in recent weeks, that is since the study was concluded in October, there have been signs of progress. The intent to negotiate, the negotiating objectives by the administration, and then, of course, the Commission's request for a negotiating mandate. As was discussed this morning, the fact that there were 2.5 years of intense negotiations during TTIP provides a basis for any further talks, but it's fairly clear that there's a major difference of opinion between the two sides. The United States is looking at a much broader trade negotiation. The Commission is focused on the industrial tariffs and on the conformity assessment agreement. And I think that the key difference, of course, is agriculture. On that, I think it's important to say that in the administration's negotiating objectives, which are summarized in the slides, They do include procurement, so it is on the table. They do include, this goes to some of the questions that were brought up, they do include specifically references to sustainable development, both labor and environment. And in fact, the United States seems to be demanding that the European Union take a stronger stance on those things than it has. They do not include ISDS, and regulatory cooperation is treated differently than under TTIP was. Key point is that the administration also signaled it would be willing to negotiate in stages, if in consultation with Congress. I think where we go next, so this gets into the scenarios. The big question, of course, is whether or not the administration will publish a study on whether or not the U.S. auto industry is in our national security interest. I am quite certain that study will come out. It will come out in mid-February, and it will state that it is in the national security interest. The question then is, what are the options that are provided to the president and what he does with those options? And there has been reports now that one of the options is, of course, to put tariffs on imports of autos and auto parts to protect the U.S. industry. But another one is to make it more focused and focused on the high-tech end of the automobile industry, that is the automated cars and electric vehicles, things of that nature, things that the Chinese are targeting. That would, of course, still affect Europe. I think that if the administration and the president chooses to use tariffs, Mr. DeMartini and Mrs. Malmstrom, of course, have both been very strong that the Commission is going to be firm. There will be no further talks with the United States. They will be willing to take rebalancing steps, and I think Mr. DeMartini alluded today to $20 billion of products where the United States is not the primary supplier. My question is, what then? You will then have already approximately $80 billion of just automotive trade and rebalancing that have been stopped between us. You will have, of course, the $10 billion or so of steel. What are we doing? This is clearly going to be a lose-lose situation, and maybe just standing firm isn't going to be the best because you don't know whether or not Mr. Trump would retaliate against your retaliation. So I think that the question here and what the conclusions of the study suggest is reframing the dynamics, understanding that Mr. Trump is saying, we've taken too much responsibility, we want to share some burden. Why not, rather than negotiate with a gun to your head, as was referred to today, why not say the European Union stands up and will take its responsibility? But if we take responsibility, we insist on authority. And then when you look at the negotiations, I think people are making a mistake carving out agriculture per se. I think another approach is to separate and distinguish between market access negotiations and regulatory issues, both for agriculture and otherwise. Many people, I think, have lost sight of the fact that the European Union is now the world's biggest agricultural exporter. You're extremely strong. You run a very strong deficit, trade surplus with the United States on agriculture. On a market access basis, you can take the United States on. And the U.S. negotiating objectives understand that they're not going to get complete duty-free treatment in agriculture. But I think you also need to understand that the issue in agriculture is not tariffs, it's the regulatory issues, it's SPS. And if those are held off to the side, you've created a new dynamic for working with the administration and yet not in any way undermined what appears to be the desire here on on agriculture and protecting the agricultural food safety issues. There are other things on rules and regulation, but I think the key is that the regulatory cooperation part needs to be kept distinct, both distinct from the trade negotiations. As Mr. DeMartini said this morning, we learned in TTIP that regulatory issues do not sit nicely into a trade agreement. And I think that that's where the division is, and that's the discussion to have with the United States. On the WTO and on China, just very briefly, I think that what the European Commission has done to engage on some of the issues that the United States has raised on the appellate body has been extremely constructive. And I think that Mr. DeMartini said the U.S. is engaging in that process. I think continue with that. I think there's room to move. The United States has made some very strong legal statements in the WTO that are actually quite reasonable about some of the appellate body practices. Then I think on China, and this is the key, it's discussed quite a bit in the paper, but I think that there's a way, the US and the EU and Japan have been cooperating very, very well on China. There's been a lot of constructive work. There is a way to make this better, which is to go for a bold and comprehensive WTO dispute settlement case that includes nullification and impairment. And here is where the European Union's key role is. Anything that to work with China, anything has to involve a large number of parties. The United States is no longer in a position to build a coalition on this. That is the role, and that would be the responsibility and the authority that the European Union can and should take up. I will stop there. I'd be happy to address any questions either now or later from you or the committee.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Who will be the first? Emmanuel.
Oui,
Yes. Well, I heard what you said, Mr. Chase. And you said that there are different negotiating tactics between the Europeans and the Americans. And I think that that goes without saying. I think that the American administration has a very brutal approach to negotiating. Sometimes they are effective, whereas the Europeans often give the impression that they are worried, and because they also are divided. We've seen that already in recent months before this debate. Now, that's the first thing. Secondly, I think you've got to be more specific on one point, because I did refer to the site of the United States Trade Representative, where they talk about the new negotiations and what could be this light treaty or this new version of treaty. And for the Americans, everything seems to be on the table. So everything from agriculture to industrial goods to transporter flows of data, all of this is up for grabs. And that's why it's not acceptable to us. So I'm just going back to what you've just said right now about agriculture, because indeed there are more European exports to the USA in agricultural products than the contrary. But the interest of the Americans today would be to ensure that if there is an alignment of legislation that would be unsupportable for Europe, in particular on the question of GMOs, because that's what their objective is. In the same way, in the American document that I consulted, they talk about progress on sustainable development, but there's no reference to COP21. There's no, and that won't surprise you from the Trump administration, but for us that's unacceptable. So when you say what option, well, I feel that we need to listen to what the Europeans are saying and see what the groups of Europeans are saying that they do not want the TTIP and CEFTA. And they're very surprised to see this kind of negotiation on regulation as well. So you should listen to what they're saying and not continue negotiating as if there was no background noise, because in fact all European people are worried about this, and the Europeans are not going to be the odd man out in the global village. And I think the Americans are trying to put them into that role. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for your presentation, Mr. Chase. I just wanted to raise a couple of comments on what we heard. First of all, as far as the scope of an agreement, what the Commission has suggested on industrial products, for example, I just wanted to say that for the European Union side, we've signed a number of agreements on climate change, and we have suffered with great disappointment the fact that the American administration has actually left the Paris Agreement. And I would actually ask how you think that things are going to be different. If you have sustainable development, how can you do this? How can you have an agreement which is going to cover industrial products when you are the people who are responsible through your production of these products? You are responsible for the the failure of our efforts to achieve sustainable development. So how are you going to actually bring those 2 points of view together? How are we going to overcome that obstacle? And secondly, as concerns the reform of the WTO and also looking at the appellate body of the WTO, you have said that it was very positive that we have these new declarations from Mr. Trump on the development of the reform of the WTO. But just before this item on our agenda, we had a discussion in this committee where we talked about the very fact that there was a public forum being organised by the WTO. It's in a interparliamentary assembly which was held in December, and we actually heard the ambassador from the European Union who is responsible for WTO matters, and we were represented by parliamentarians from all countries in the WTO, and they all agreed that the position of the United States was very clear, that they do not believe in having a new appellate body, and they're not going to help to resolve these disputes between member states or between investor states. So I think that there is a problem of a very different position being taken by the USA, and also the WTO in particular is based on a certain set of rules, and the appellate body is part of the way in which it functions. So do you think that there is a way out here? Can you give us some good news on this? Also, you say that in the question of regulatory cooperation, you said it's that the non-tariff barriers are perhaps more important than actually the tariffs themselves. But you said that your focus on regulatory cooperation is different from TTIP. I'm wondering what you base that argument on. In what way is your focus different? And you talked about the commercial deficit with the USA. Are you talking about tariff differences or other factors? Is it because of competitiveness? Is it consumer preferences? Is it design issues? Because a lot of American consumers actually choose European cars, European brands, rather than American cars. So what type of explanation is there to actually understand Trump's position? He always seems to think that the other side is to blame. So I'm interested to hear your opinion on this. Thank you.
And perhaps from my side, Helmut Scholz. No. The question on the relation with China. Regarding this ethos, as you call it, from Trump and his methods, I think we should not run into the same direction the United States did on China. So in the discussion we had with the US administration, it was the only common approach, the problems we have with China. But regarding the necessity to stabilize the global trading system, regarding the fact that China is now a full member of WTO, regarding the fact that, of course, they recognize that they have some troubles with this trade war with the United States. In my point of view, they are a little bit more open to accept discussions about reforming WTO, which are perhaps not only in their interest. And just trying to build a bloc against China is not the solution. And sometimes the reaction of the United States against China seems to be a little bit over the top. You mentioned that the European Union presented some proposals for the reform of the appellate body. And this was, as Ima mentioned, totally rejected by the US ambassador to the WTO. Also with the argument, perhaps not the argument, but the position, these reform proposals are supported by China. This can't be the level of discussion and the level of cooperation we need at the moment. So, Helmut.
Danke, Vorsitzender.
Thank you, Chairman. Just 2 points to make, because I think we've got to be, I'm not going to repeat what everyone else has said today, but I just want to make a clear distinction about what we're talking about. Who's actually benefiting from this situation? Who's going to benefit from these new agreements? We're talking about industrial goods. And here, yet again, and I think it's interesting to hear more about this, but we're back at onto the question as to under what conditions will these goods be produced? What type of impact they're going to have on the environment? What impact will it have on employment policy? And, for example, how will it affect small and medium-sized companies? How it's going to affect competitiveness of European products on the American market? So, where's the added value to that agreement if we are going to be dealing in such a very, very narrow field? I think we've got to ask ourselves the question that as to whether the two partners have got very different views as to how they're going to continue to develop a commercial relationship between the USA and the EU. Each is thinking of it in their own terms. And I don't think that they really understand the fact that we need to have a joint, a common added value. So what contribution would an agreement, what added value would we get, or what kind of contribution would an agreement, a commercial agreement with the USA, what contribution would that make to establishing a good multilateral trading system? Because I don't think just benefiting from a market in a bilateral situation is actually sufficient. We've got to see what the impact is on others. We've already seen a study on the impact of all of these free trade agreements that exist and bilateral agreements, and we've seen that the effect of this in terms of job creation and other things is actually a positive, is generally speaking a positive thing over time. But if you look at the CETA agreement, the EFTA agreement, and all of the other agreements that we have agreed with the European Union, they've all had very positive influences elsewhere. We've got the proof that there is actually an added value to these multilateral agreements. But what about these bilateral? In a bilateral agreement, does it have a direct impact upon, a positive impact on these other areas, different from a multilateral agreement? The large emerging economies are also going to come to us and say that they don't have to worry about other aspects of an agreement other than the narrow bilateral interests. So what about the global transnational companies that will also be impacted by these bilateral deals or bilateral agreements? What about the role of those companies? Looking at the question of finance policy, investment policy of the American administration, when you look, you'll see that their policy is so organized today that they serve American interests first and foremost. Now, we've got no counterpart to that. So I'm just focusing really on the very narrow circumstance of this agreement. I want to wonder where you see the added value of such a narrowly defined agreement. Peter, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, I'm very conscious of the time.
Microphone, sir.
Thank you very much. I'm very conscious of your time. I'm wondering how I should get through all of these. First, one of the questions was about agriculture and whether or not agriculture should be included. And again, I think that you need to look at the differences between the two sets of issues, one being market access and one being regulatory issues. I think you made the point that what the U.S. approach to food safety is unsustainable and not wanted, not agreed to here, and that's precisely my point. I think that those two issues, that you can look at regulatory issues differently from market access issues, which gets actually specifically to the question that you asked about the difference between the approach in TTIP and what I think is a way forward. And the way forward is, as Mr. Director General DeMarti stressed this morning, as TTIP clearly showed us, as in fact many of the NGOs have said, regulatory issues do not belong in a trade agreement. The trade agreement should be an agreement about trade. Regulatory issues need to be addressed by the regulators and the regulators themselves, and they need to look at whether or not they are in fact reaching the right levels of protection. On which, going back to the question about the agricultural side, it's interesting to me that in the negotiating directives, nowhere does the negotiating objectives, the administration does not say that they want to get rid of Europe's approach to agricultural biotechnology. Rather, what they say is it should be science-based and should be worked through, that sort of process. And I think here, people need to recognize that, of course, the EU does have a very good, strong science-based policy for the approval of agricultural biotech products. 70 some odd are approved last time I looked for use, import and use on the market. And that's based on your own scientific evaluation, and that's the way it should be. But I think that there's room for cooperation and that does not come into the context, need not come into the context of a trade negotiation. On the China, and then I'll go to the WTO last. On China, I could not agree with you more, Mr. Chairman. Ganging up on China is not the way to do it. However, the Chinese leadership itself, I think, has recognized on numerous occasions that the overcapacity that it sees in its economy is a sign that things are not working as well in its economy as they should do. They need to do some reforms for their own purposes. The fact that they do have that overcapacity in multiple industries, not just in steel, but in multiple industries, is one of the reasons that many developing countries did not want to liberalize further during the negotiations of the Doha round. They did not want to be taken over by the Chinese export juggernaut. My point is the rest of the world, not just the United States, not just the EU, and not just Japan, the rest of the world actually has an equity in encouraging China to make some of the reforms that it needs to undertake, because this excess capacity, state subsidies, things like that, have an impact on European interests as well, and Japanese, and Brazilian, and Korean, and Indonesian. Those things need to be part of a diplomatic initiative, which is different from ganging up on. It's just being clear that there are some things that needs to be done. On the appellate body, the two questions that were asked, I've read most of the submissions that the U.S. administration has put forward. Some of them are 30 pages about one small aspect of the way in which the appellate body had worked. It needs to be stressed that the concern about the appellate body predates the Trump administration, and that if the Trump administration spent so much time talking about these specific details that were problematic within the rules of the appellate body and the WTO, that's not someone who wants to just ditch the system, but it's someone who's trying to engage constructively. And I think that the important part was that the Commission took up many of the issues that the United States has raised and put them in its own communication. The one difference that the administration and the Commission really have is that the administration does not like the appellate body's decision on zero doubling on anti-dumping and countervailing duties. They want to question those previous judgments as opposed to just reforming the process. I think the Commission was right in saying let's focus on the process first. The administration, I think, ultimately will have to come around, because without the appellate body working, you're right, the dispute settlement system doesn't work the way it's meant to have done. And that gets, I guess, finally to the last question by Mr. Schultz about where's the added value in a bilateral agreement? How do bilateral agreements detract from a multilateral effort? I think everyone would prefer general multilateral liberalization. As I said, I think many countries, the Doha negotiations underscored that many developing countries were not interested in liberalizing if China was simply going to overwhelm them. And I think we have the MFN basis, and that's what would happen. And that's another reason why China's reforms are actually in its own interest, because it would put forward more multilateral liberalization. Without that, the members, including the EU, have gone to bilateral agreements to try to liberalize where they can. And as you said, many of those agreements have had very strong positive effects. I think there's a lot more in that discussion, but I think I should stop here because I'm cognizant of your schedule.